My name is Num. I'm 33 years old, and for the better part of a decade I've worked as a licensed insolvency trustee at a firm on the east side of Calgary. Most people hear the title and nod politely, while their eyes search for a way out of the conversation. My father heard it and laughed. The moment I returned to most often happened on a Tuesday evening in October, during my firm's annual client appreciation event. We'd booked a private dining room at a steakhouse on 17th Avenue. The kind of place with heavy linen napkins, and a wine list that costs more than most people's monthly car payments. My father came because my mother had quietly insisted, and because my father rarely declines an invitation to any room where successful people are gathered. He arrived 40 minutes late, still finishing a call about a land acquisition in Airdrie. I watched him scan the room, taking in the suits and the name tags and the low hum of professional conversation. Then he spotted me, beside one of my senior partners, and he crossed the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never once doubted his welcome. He shook my partner's hand, asked a few sharp questions about commercial real estate financing trends, and then, when the conversation turned back to me, he placed one heavy arm around my shoulders, raised his glass of Malbec toward the room, and said it loud enough for the table beside us to go quiet. "My daughter has built her whole career around other people's failures," he said, smiling broadly. "I build things that last. She figures out what to do when they don't." A few people laughed. A few more looked away. My partner produced the careful smile of someone choosing to say nothing. I kept my face completely still, excused myself to refill my water glass, and walked to the washroom, where I stood at the sink for 2 full minutes with my hands braced against the counter, before I went back out and continued the evening as though nothing had happened. I had spent 6 years studying, articling, and sitting board examinations to earn my designation. I had passed a joint insolvency examination on my second attempt, which is not unusual, because it is not a small examination, and then completed 2 years of supervised practice before I was fully licensed. I had read files that would have broken most people. Families who had worked their entire lives and still lost everything. Business owners who had made one wrong decision in a bad season and ended up in proceedings that dismantled everything they'd built. I had learned to sit in those rooms without flinching, to deliver difficult information clearly and without cruelty, and to understand that what I was doing, at its core, was helping people move through the worst passage of their financial lives and come out the other side still standing. None of that made it into the summary my father delivered to a steakhouse dining room in October. My father built his reputation on residential and commercial real estate development across southern Alberta. He started with infill projects in inner-city Calgary when I was still in high school, then scaled steadily through the 2000s as the city expanded outward. By the time I earned my license, his portfolio included townhouse complexes in Auburn Bay, a mixed-use development near Cochrane, and a commercial park on the eastern edge of Chestermere. His name appeared in the Calgary Herald business section regularly. He was the kind of person other business owners mentioned with deference, experienced, decisive, never short of a new project on the horizon. My younger brother managed field operations for the company. At family dinners, my mother introduced him by job title, and the way she said it carried weight and pride in equal measure. She introduced me by saying I worked in finance, downtown, somewhere. I stopped correcting her. The correction always produced the same sequence of polite questions. What kind of finance? Insolvency? Insolvency, is that like accounting? And answering those questions always ended in the same gentle redirection toward something more comfortable. My father's newest development, my brother's latest project. The conversation would find its current and float back toward familiar water, and I would sit there, refill my glass, and listen. What nobody at those dinners understood was that the work I did required its own particular intelligence, an ability to hold a company's entire financial life in mind simultaneously, to see the structure beneath the numbers, to identify not just where the money had gone, but why it had gone there, and what, if anything, could still be recovered. It was methodical and demanding, and, in its best moments, genuinely valuable to people who had nowhere else to turn. A colleague at my firm named Howard left a copy of a Herald article on my desk one afternoon without comment. My father had been quoted in a piece about the city's development outlook. He had said, "The only failure in business is giving up before the market turns." Howard circled the line in blue pen, raised one eyebrow at me across the office, and went back to his desk. I put the article in the recycling bin and returned to the file I was reading. 9 months after the steakhouse evening, an urgent file arrived on my desk. The company requesting creditor protection was a mid-sized real estate development firm based in Calgary. 11 active projects across the city and surrounding municipalities, 64 full-time employees, approximately 380 active subcontractor invoices outstanding. Total secured and unsecured creditor exposure, $11.2 million. I recognized the registered company name before I reached the second page. I set the file down. Outside my window, the Bow River was running fast with spring runoff, the water pale and opaque with glacial silt. The sky over the Saddle Dome was the flat gray of a city still deciding whether winter was really finished. I picked the file back up and walked down the hall to my supervising partner's office. He read the first page. He looked at me. "Do you want to recuse?" I thought about it for what felt like a long time. "No," I said, "but the relationship should be fully disclosed." My firm disclosed the family connection to all relevant parties. I was not named trustee of record. My role was limited to analysis and internal review support, the appropriate professional boundary, and also, I kept telling myself, the only boundary that truly mattered. I began working through the file that same afternoon. The revenue picture looked strong. Contracts were active, projects were ongoing, and the company's gross figures would have impressed anyone glancing at the top line. But cash flow told a completely different story. Over the previous 18 months, my father had acquired 3 new project sites in rapid succession, each requiring significant upfront capital, land purchase costs, Phase 1 environmental assessments, municipal development fees, while 2 earlier projects had fallen 4 to 6 weeks behind schedule due to supply chain backlogs and a regional shortage of skilled trades workers. Clients on completed phases were holding back final payments longer than their contracts permitted. 2 major suppliers had quietly tightened their credit terms after a delayed payment in January. The company's operating line at the bank had been drawn to its ceiling in February and hadn't moved since. The business wasn't running out of work, it was running out of runway. As I worked through the payroll records, I started recognizing names I'd seen somewhere other than professional files. Not from previous proceedings, but from Saturday mornings when I was 12, and my father would take me to job sites, letting me trail behind him with a hard hat 2 sizes too large. I remembered a site supervisor who used to bring me a hot chocolate from the Tim Hortons on Deerfoot, knowing I found construction sites loud and cold and a little frightening. I remembered a project manager who crouched down and explained elevation drawings to me like I was a person worth the time. I remembered those faces attached to those small kindnesses, and then I looked at them on a payroll register and understood, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to understand before, that the file on my desk wasn't simply a business problem. It was the financial architecture of hundreds of ordinary lives. I closed the folder, went to the kitchen, and stood at the window looking out at the parking lot for several minutes before going back to my desk. My brother called on a Thursday evening, 3 days after I'd started the review. He didn't ease into it. He said he knew I was involved in some capacity, and asked directly whether there was anything I could do. I told him what I always told family members who asked me professional questions, that insolvency proceedings involve creditors, legal counsel, court oversight, and a licensed trustee, and that no single analyst steers the outcome. I said my role was analytical. I said I couldn't promise anything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are people who've been with him for 15 years. They've got mortgages, kids in school. They're not asking for anything special. They just need to know if there's going to be a company to come back to in the fall." I already knew the names he was about to mention before he said them. After we hung up, I sat in my car in the firm's underground parkade for 20 minutes. Engine off, the concrete pillars around me orange under the fluorescent lights. Before going back upstairs to finish preparing the document package for the creditor meeting. My supervising partner asked me to stay late one evening, toward the end of the second week. He closed the conference room door and set 2 folders side by side on the long table. My father's file, and a second file belonging to a different development firm that had applied for protection the previous month. The second company had a smaller creditor pool, a simpler project list, and considerably cleaner internal financial records. He said, "Set the names aside entirely. Tell me which company the numbers support." I spent close to an hour comparing both files. When I finally answered, I surprised myself with how clearly I could see it. The second company was simpler to restructure and lower risk to creditors by every conventional measure. My father's company was more complicated, more exposed, and carried a decade's worth of financial habits that had served him well in a rising market and were now working methodically against him. But it also employed 4 times as many people and had active projects that, if completed properly, would deliver real value to purchasers and communities that had been waiting on them. I set both folders back on the table and told my partner exactly what I'd found, without softening a word of it. He nodded slowly. He said, "That's all I needed to know." The creditor meeting was held in a boardroom on the 22nd floor of an office tower on Center Street. Secured creditors, counsel for the bank, counsel for the largest trade creditors, the court-appointed trustee, our monitoring team. The kind of room that requires everyone in it to choose their words with precision. My father arrived with 2 lawyers. He wore a charcoal suit I recognized from a Herald photograph. He greeted several people in the room by name, with the ease of someone who rarely meets a stranger in a professional setting. He didn't see me immediately. I was seated along the side wall, with the junior members of the monitoring team, not at the main table. When he finally turned and noticed me, something crossed his face that moved through quickly, surprise, and then something more complicated beneath it, and then a deliberate settling back into professional composure. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he looked back toward the front of the room. 40 minutes into the session, the trustee turned to our team for the operational review. My partner asked me to present the cash flow analysis. I stood and walked the room through the timing gaps between project draws and supplier obligations, the holdback structure, and how it had become a structural liability rather than a temporary cash shortage. The cumulative effect of sequential land acquisitions outpacing the company's ability to absorb upfront costs. I did not look at my father while I spoke. I was not performing objectivity, I was practicing it, which is not the same thing, but is the version that actually holds under pressure. When I finished, there was a short silence. One of the creditor's lawyers asked a follow-up question. I answered it directly. My father's lead counsel took notes. My father himself remained completely still, his eyes on the table in front of him, or on his counsel, or on some point in the middle distance I couldn't locate. I noticed, before I sat back down, that his hands were folded on the table the same way I had seen them folded at family dinners, when a conversation had moved somewhere he hadn't expected. I had always read it as impatience. Sitting in that boardroom, I understood for the first time that it was something else entirely. The court granted CCAA protection the following week with conditions that were stricter than my father's advisors had predicted, and that his legal team advised him to accept without amendment. An independent financial monitor would remain active for a minimum of 18 months. All new project acquisitions were suspended for the duration. Executive compensation was reduced. Any capital expenditure above a defined threshold required monitor approval before it could be released to the bank. Every quarter, the company would file a progress report directly with the court. My father signed every page without requesting a single change. In the months that followed, the work resumed, carefully and more slowly than before. Subcontractors started receiving payments within their invoice terms for the first time in over a year. Project schedules, no longer bending under the pressure of constant simultaneous expansion, began moving toward completion instead of perpetual deferral. The bank held its position. The projects kept building. My brother called once during that period to say things felt different at the office. More deliberate, less like running, and more like actually going somewhere. He said it the way you say something when you're not sure if it's a complaint or a relief. And I told him it was probably both at once, and that was generally what recovery looked like from the inside. I ran into the site supervisor, the one with the Tim Hortons hot chocolates, at a hardware store in Forest Lawn in late October. He recognized me across the aisle and walked over, a bag of cement mix under one arm. He said he'd heard I was involved in the restructuring. He said it the way you say something, when you want the other person to know the weight behind it, without making either of you stand to sit in that weight any longer than necessary. Your dad talks about you differently now, he said. I asked what he meant. Told us his daughter did the financial review. Said she was the straightest shooter in that boardroom. He shifted the bag to his other arm. He's not easy with compliments. I've worked for him 11 years. You'd know what I mean. I thanked him. He walked away toward the checkout, and I stood in the aisle a moment longer than I needed to, looking at nothing in particular. My father had never called after our coffee in Kensington, the quiet meeting where he had admitted, without quite saying it directly, that he had held on too long to the belief that one more project would always correct the last one. There was no message after that, no letter, no formal acknowledgement of what had passed between us or what I had done. But he had said those words to a man who had worked for him for 11 years, in the middle of a hardware store, on a weekday morning, when there was nothing left to gain from saying them. For my father, that was not nothing. It was, in its own language, considerable. Some people make large, clean declarations. My father had always built things in front of other people rather than talking about building them. It made a certain sense that acknowledgement would work the same way for him, assembled gradually, piece by piece, in places I wasn't standing. The CCA proceedings discharged formally the following spring. The monitor submitted the final progress report. 3 projects had reached substantial completion. Creditor debt had been reduced by 38%. The bank renewed the operating line under standard commercial terms with no extraordinary conditions attached. My partner walked the closure summary to my desk himself and set it down with a sticky note on top. Good instincts throughout, keep that. I filed the note with the rest of the documents, closed the folder, and placed it on the shelf behind my desk. That autumn, the Urban Development Institute held their annual recognition luncheon at a hotel downtown. Our firm sponsored a table. I went because we were expected to, not because I expected anything in particular from the afternoon. I sat beside Howard, who spent most of the program reading something on his phone, and occasionally commenting on it under his breath. My father was among several developers acknowledged for project completions during what the program described as a period of significant market adjustment. He stood at the podium with the easy posture of someone accustomed to rooms like this one. He thanked his team, he thanked his trades and subcontractors. He made a remark about interest rates that landed better than it probably deserved. And then, before he stepped back from the microphone, he paused. He said that the past 2 years had taught him something he hadn't thought he still needed to learn. That the people you're closest to are sometimes the last people you truly see. He said a person could spend decades building things and still not understand the real difference between expansion and stability, until someone who actually knew the numbers sat across from them and showed them the gap without looking away. He didn't look toward our table. He said, "I have a daughter who does the kind of work that most people don't think to value until the moment they need it. I should have been paying attention long before I needed it." The room applauded. Howard looked up from his phone. I looked at the white tablecloth in front of me and kept my expression quiet. I didn't go to find him afterward. The acknowledgement had been public, unrehearsed, and offered when there was nothing practical left to gain from offering it. That was the part that counted. Not the sentiment exactly, but the conditions under which he had finally found his way to it. I was promoted to partner the following January. My name went on the firm's website, which mattered less than imagined it would, and more than I can entirely explain. What it meant in practice was that junior associates now brought their difficult files to my desk, the way I had once brought mine to other people's desks, watching their faces to understand what to do with what I was seeing. One afternoon, a young associate set a file in front of me for a family-owned landscaping company in Okotoks. Small creditor pool, complicated family dynamics threaded through the business ownership structure. The owner's daughter handling the bookkeeping without drawing a salary. He mentioned it the way you mention something you think is incidental. I put down what I was reading and told him to walk me through every page, starting from the beginning. People sometimes ask whether my relationship with my father became something genuinely different after all of it. The honest answer is, somewhat, and slowly, and in ways I hadn't quite anticipated or imagined for myself during the long years, when being seen by him felt like something I still needed. We didn't become the kind of people who phone each other on weekday evenings, or drop by unannounced on Sunday afternoons. The distance that grows across years of quiet dismissal doesn't simply close because circumstances change. That isn't how distance works, and it isn't how people work either. What changed was something quieter and, in the end, more durable. At family dinners, he began asking what I was working on, not every time, and not with conspicuous curiosity, but he asked. He stayed in the answer instead of looking for the door out of it. My mother began introducing me to people she wanted to impress. My brother and I found the beginning of something that might, in time, become an ordinary friendship, tentative, unhurried, built on ground we're still learning together. One Friday evening in late spring, I left the office and drove south through the downtown core, past a construction hoarding on 6th Avenue that I had walked by dozens of times without stopping. This time I did. Through the gap in the boards, I could see the skeleton of a new building going up. Rebar and poured concrete and the open geometry of something that didn't exist yet, but was becoming itself floor by floor. A yellow crane was swinging a load slowly across the gray sky. I stood there and watched it for a minute, the city moving around me in all directions, before I continued on. The work my father had once described as a record of other people's failures had never been that. It had always been something harder to name and slower to recognize. A particular kind of attention paid to the moment just before collapse, the precise space where, if someone understood the numbers clearly enough, and was willing to say exactly what they saw without softening it for the room, something could still be saved. I had always known that. I had simply spent a long time waiting for someone closer to home to figure it out. It turned out he got there eventually. He arrived the way most people arrive at the things that matter. Not in one clean moment, but across many small decisions made over time, each one a little less like the person he'd been before. That in the end was more than enough.